Question 1. When evaluating a situation where a U.S. Supreme Court police officer encounters an individual they know socially during a routine patrol that raises suspicion of a federal offense, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure adherence to U.S. constitutional and federal law enforcement standards? Option A. Initiate a more aggressive and intrusive investigation than would normally be warranted, in an attempt to demonstrate absolute impartiality and avoid any perception of bias. Option B. Immediately inform the acquaintance of the suspicion and advise them on how to best avoid legal repercussions before proceeding with any official action. Option C. Conduct a thorough and impartial investigation based on observable facts and probable cause, documenting all findings and actions meticulously, and proceeding according to standard federal law enforcement procedures. Option D. Minimize the interaction and avoid a full investigation to prevent any appearance of impropriety or favoritism towards the acquaintance, focusing only on immediate safety concerns. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough and impartial investigation based on observable facts and probable cause, documenting all findings and actions meticulously, and proceeding according to standard federal law enforcement procedures. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a law enforcement officer's duty to uphold the law and the potential for personal relationships to influence judgment. The U.S. Supreme Court police officer's role demands impartiality and adherence to the U.S. Constitution and federal law, particularly concerning the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. A careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions are based on objective facts and legal standards, not on personal connections. The best professional approach involves strictly adhering to established legal procedures and departmental policy, regardless of personal acquaintance. This means conducting a thorough investigation based on probable cause and presenting evidence objectively, without any attempt to shield or unduly scrutinize an acquaintance. This approach is correct because it upholds the principle of equal justice under the law, a cornerstone of the U.S. legal system. It aligns with the U.S. Supreme Court's commitment to constitutional rights and the expectation that law enforcement officers will act without bias. The officer's duty is to the law and the public trust, which necessitates treating all individuals the same when enforcing legal statutes. An incorrect approach would be to overlook potential evidence or to conduct a cursory investigation simply because the individual is known. This failure to conduct a thorough and impartial investigation violates the officer's duty to uphold the law and could lead to a miscarriage of justice. It also erodes public trust in law enforcement's impartiality. Another incorrect approach would be to actively seek out minor infractions to justify a more intrusive search or arrest, motivated by a desire to appear unbiased or to preemptively address perceived favoritism. This constitutes an abuse of authority and a violation of the Fourth Amendment, as it would be based on a pretext rather than genuine probable cause. Such actions undermine the integrity of the legal process and can lead to the suppression of evidence in court. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes objective evidence and legal standards above all else. This involves a conscious effort to identify and mitigate personal biases, consulting departmental policies and legal precedents, and seeking guidance from supervisors when in doubt. The core principle is to act with integrity and to ensure that every action taken is legally justifiable and ethically sound, thereby preserving the rule of law and the public's confidence. Question 2. The analysis reveals that a U.S. Supreme Court police officer, while on duty near the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., observes a known acquaintance of a Supreme Court justice commit a minor traffic violation. The officer has a friendly but not close personal relationship with this individual. What is the most appropriate course of action for the officer to take? Option A. Overlook the traffic violation due to the personal acquaintance with the individual and the perceived minor nature of the infraction. Option B. Informally speak to the individual about the violation, accept their apology, and allow them to proceed without issuing a citation or filing a report. Option C. Document the traffic violation accurately, issue a citation according to standard procedure, and report the incident to their supervisor, recusing themselves from any further involvement if a personal relationship could be perceived as influencing the outcome. Option D. Issue a citation, but then contact their supervisor to request leniency for the individual based on the officer's personal relationship with them. The correct answer is C. Document the traffic violation accurately, issue a citation according to standard procedure, and report the incident to their supervisor, recusing themselves from any further involvement if a personal relationship could be perceived as influencing the outcome. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a law enforcement officer's duty to uphold the law and the potential for personal relationships to influence judgment. The U.S. Supreme Court police officers' role demands impartiality and adherence to strict ethical standards, particularly when interacting with individuals who may have connections to the court or its personnel. The need for objective enforcement of laws, regardless of personal acquaintance, is paramount to maintaining public trust and the integrity of the judicial process. The best professional approach involves a strict adherence to established protocols for handling potential conflicts of interest and ensuring fair and impartial enforcement of laws. This means documenting the interaction accurately, reporting the observed infraction to the appropriate authorities without bias, and recusing oneself from any further involvement if a personal relationship could be perceived as influencing the outcome. This approach is correct because it aligns with the fundamental ethical principles of law enforcement, including fairness, impartiality, and accountability, as well as the specific mandates for U.S. Supreme Court police officers to maintain the security and integrity of the court. It prioritizes the rule of law over personal considerations and ensures that all individuals are treated equally under the law. An incorrect approach would be to overlook the infraction due to the acquaintance. This failure stems from a disregard for the principle of equal application of the law and a potential violation of departmental policy regarding the reporting of observed offenses. It creates an appearance of favoritism, undermining the officer's credibility and the public's trust in the U.S. Supreme Court police. Another incorrect approach would be to confront the individual informally and accept an apology without further action. While seemingly an attempt to resolve the matter amicably, this bypasses the established legal and procedural framework for addressing infractions. It fails to create a record of the incident, potentially allowing for repeated offenses, and again, creates an appearance of preferential treatment, which is ethically unacceptable for an officer of the U.S. Supreme Court police. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to report the infraction, but then attempt to influence the outcome based on the personal relationship. This represents a severe ethical breach, as it directly compromises the officer's impartiality and attempts to subvert the due process of law. It is a clear violation of the trust placed in law enforcement officers to act solely in the interest of justice. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to legal statutes, departmental policies, and ethical codes of conduct. This involves a clear understanding of one's duties, a commitment to impartiality, and the courage to act objectively even when personal relationships are involved. When faced with a situation that could involve a conflict of interest, the professional should first identify the potential conflict, then consult relevant policies and procedures, and finally, take the action that best upholds the integrity of their office and the principles of justice. Question 3. Operational review demonstrates that U.S. Supreme Court police officers are frequently tasked with maintaining security and order within the court's premises. In a scenario where an individual is observed exhibiting behavior that appears suspicious and potentially disruptive, but without any overt indication of criminal intent or immediate threat, which of the following actions best aligns with the legal and ethical obligations of a U.S. Supreme Court police officer? Option A. Approach the individual to politely inquire about their presence and observe their demeanor and actions for any further indicators of concern, while remaining prepared to articulate specific, observable facts if further action is deemed necessary. Option B. Immediately detain and search the individual based on the subjective feeling that their behavior is off and could potentially lead to a security breach. Option C. Ignore the individual's behavior entirely, assuming it is not a direct threat, and continue with routine patrols without any further observation or engagement. Option D. Conduct a thorough search of the individual's personal belongings, including bags and pockets, due to their unusual attire which deviates from typical visitor dress. The correct answer is A. Approach the individual to politely inquire about their presence and observe their demeanor and actions for any further indicators of concern, while remaining prepared to articulate specific, observable facts if further action is deemed necessary. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between the need for swift action to protect public safety and the constitutional rights of individuals, specifically the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. U.S. Supreme Court police officers are entrusted with upholding these rights while maintaining order within the court's premises. Misinterpreting or overstepping jurisdictional boundaries or legal precedents can lead to significant legal repercussions, damage to public trust, and compromise the integrity of the judicial process. Careful judgment is required to balance these competing interests. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves officers acting within their established legal authority and adhering strictly to established Supreme Court precedent regarding searches and seizures. This means understanding the nuances of probable cause, reasonable suspicion, and the exceptions to the warrant requirement as defined by the U.S. Supreme Court. When faced with a situation that might warrant a search, officers must be able to articulate specific, articulable facts that justify their actions, ensuring they do not infringe upon an individual's constitutional rights. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the U.S. Constitution, particularly the Fourth Amendment, and the extensive body of Supreme Court case law interpreting it. It prioritizes legal compliance and the protection of fundamental rights, which is paramount for law enforcement operating in such a sensitive environment. Incorrect approach is analysis. Acting solely on a hunch or a general feeling of suspicion, without specific, articulable facts to support a belief that a crime has been committed or is about to be committed, constitutes a failure to meet the legal standard for reasonable suspicion or probable cause. This approach violates the Fourth Amendment's requirement for searches to be based on probable cause, or at least reasonable suspicion for investigatory stops. Conducting a full search of an individual's belongings or person based on a minor infraction, such as a dress code violation, without any indication of criminal activity, is an overreach of authority. This action fails to establish a nexus between the infraction and a threat to safety or security that would justify a more intrusive search, thereby violating Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches. Delaying action indefinitely while waiting for a warrant for a situation that presents an immediate and clear danger to life or property, where such danger is not based on speculation but on concrete evidence, could also be professionally problematic. While warrants are generally required, the Supreme Court has recognized exigent circumstances as an exception. Failing to act when there is a demonstrable, immediate threat that could be mitigated by a lawful search or seizure, and where obtaining a warrant is impractical, could lead to preventable harm and a dereliction of duty to protect. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the U.S. Constitution, particularly the Fourth Amendment, and all relevant Supreme Court rulings. When confronted with a situation requiring a potential search or seizure, officers must first assess whether they have the requisite legal justification, reasonable suspicion, or probable cause, based on specific, observable facts. They should then consider the least intrusive means necessary to address the situation. If a search is contemplated, officers must be able to articulate the specific facts that support the search and ensure it falls within a recognized exception to the warrant requirement, or that a warrant has been obtained. Continuous training and adherence to legal counsel's guidance are crucial for navigating these complex legal and ethical considerations. Question 4. Implementation of a lawful search and seizure protocol. In a United States Supreme Court police officer scenario, an officer observes an individual quickly enter a known drug house and then immediately exit, discarding a small package into a nearby trash receptacle. The officer has probable cause to believe the package contains illegal narcotics. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the officer? Option A. Wait for backup to arrive before taking any action, allowing the trash receptacle to remain unsecured. Option B. Enter the residence without a warrant to apprehend the individual and search for additional narcotics. Option C. Secure the trash receptacle to preserve the package as evidence and immediately begin the process of obtaining a search warrant for the trash receptacle and the residence. Option D. Knock on the door of the residence and request consent to search the trash receptacle and the residence. Correct answer is C. Secure the trash receptacle to preserve the package as evidence and immediately begin the process of obtaining a search warrant for the trash receptacle and the residence. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common yet challenging situation for law enforcement officers in the United States. The core challenge lies in balancing the immediate need to secure evidence with the constitutional rights of individuals, specifically the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. The officer must make a rapid, on-the-spot decision that could have significant legal ramifications if mishandled. The pressure of a potential crime in progress, coupled with the need for swift action, can complicate the application of established legal principles. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves securing the immediate area to prevent the destruction of evidence and to ensure officer safety, while simultaneously initiating the process to obtain a warrant. This approach acknowledges the exigent circumstances that might justify a limited protective entry, but crucially, it prioritizes obtaining judicial authorization before conducting a more extensive search or seizure. This aligns with the Fourth Amendment's requirement for warrants based on probable cause, unless a specific, well-defined exception applies. By securing the scene and seeking a warrant, the officer demonstrates respect for constitutional rights while taking prudent steps to preserve potential evidence. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves entering the residence without a warrant and immediately conducting a thorough search for drugs. This directly violates the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. Unless a recognized exception to the warrant requirement, such as consent, hot pursuit, or plain view, is clearly and unequivocally present, such an entry and search are unlawful. The potential for evidence to be destroyed does not automatically create an exception to the warrant requirement for a full search. Another incorrect approach is to do nothing and wait for a warrant without securing the immediate area. While waiting for a warrant is generally the correct course of action for a full search, failing to secure the scene in this situation risks the destruction of the very evidence the officer suspects is present. This inaction could lead to the loss of crucial evidence, hindering the investigation and potentially allowing a suspect to escape or dispose of contraband. A third incorrect approach is to knock on the door and ask for consent to search. While seeking consent is a valid method to bypass the warrant requirement, doing so without first securing the scene could allow the occupants to destroy evidence before consent is even requested or given. Furthermore, if consent is refused, the officer would have lost valuable time and potentially allowed evidence to disappear, all without having taken steps to preserve it. Professional reasoning. Professionals in law enforcement must employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes constitutional compliance, officer safety, and effective investigation. This involves a continuous assessment of the situation against established legal standards and departmental policy. When faced with potential exigent circumstances, officers should consider the narrow exceptions to the warrant requirement. However, the default and preferred course of action for searches and seizures is to obtain a warrant. In situations where immediate action is necessary to preserve evidence or ensure safety, officers should take the minimum necessary steps to achieve those goals while simultaneously initiating the warrant process. This layered approach ensures that constitutional rights are respected while still allowing for effective law enforcement. Question 5. To address the challenge of a U.S. Supreme Court police officer responding to a report of suspicious activity in a high-traffic area of the Supreme Court building, where an individual is observed pacing nervously and repeatedly looking at their watch, what is the most appropriate initial course of action? Option A. Use physical force to detain the individual without any verbal communication. Option B. Immediately detain and search the individual based on the observed nervous behavior. Option C. Approach the individual, issue clear verbal commands to stop and identify themselves, and observe their behavior for further indicators of threat or criminal activity. Option D. Ignore the individual's behavior and continue with routine patrol duties. The correct answer is C. Approach the individual, issue clear verbal commands to stop and identify themselves, and observe their behavior for further indicators of threat or criminal activity. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a law enforcement officer's duty to protect and serve and the constitutional rights of individuals, specifically the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. The officer must make a rapid judgment call based on limited information, where a wrong decision could lead to a constitutional violation or a missed opportunity to prevent harm. The need for swift action in a potentially dangerous situation, complicates the application of legal standards. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves the officer immediately seeking to de-escalate the situation through verbal commands and attempting to establish probable cause for a lawful stop and potential search. This approach prioritizes constitutional rights while still addressing the perceived threat. Specifically, the officer should clearly and audibly command the individual to stop and identify themselves, while simultaneously observing the individual's actions and surroundings for further indicators of criminal activity or immediate danger. This aligns with the principles of lawful stops under the Fourth Amendment, which requires reasonable suspicion that criminal activity is afoot. If reasonable suspicion is established, the officer can then proceed with a limited pat-down for weapons if there is a reasonable belief the person is armed and dangerous. This methodical approach respects individual liberties while allowing for necessary law enforcement action. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that involves immediately detaining and searching the individual without any further observation or attempt at verbal de-escalation would be a violation of the Fourth Amendment. This constitutes an unreasonable seizure and search, as it lacks the necessary probable cause or reasonable suspicion. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the situation entirely and proceed without any investigation, despite the observed behavior. While respecting individual liberty is paramount, officers have a duty to investigate suspicious circumstances that could indicate criminal activity or a threat to public safety. This inaction could be seen as a dereliction of duty. Finally, an approach that involves using excessive force to detain the individual before any attempt at verbal communication or assessment of threat is also professionally unacceptable. This would likely violate the Fourth Amendment's prohibition against unreasonable seizures and could lead to civil liability and disciplinary action. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes constitutional rights while balancing them with the need for public safety. This involves a continuous assessment of the situation, starting with observation and verbal engagement. If reasonable suspicion of criminal activity or danger arises, officers should proceed with legally permissible investigative steps, such as a lawful stop, and if warranted, a pat-down for weapons. The use of force should always be a last resort and proportionate to the threat. Question 6. Examination of the data shows that during a routine traffic stop in a public area of Washington, D.C., a U.S. Supreme Court police officer observes a civilian using a smartphone to record the interaction from the sidewalk. The civilian is not obstructing traffic or interfering with the officer's duties, but is standing approximately 20 feet away. The officer feels uncomfortable and believes the recording may be intimidating. What is the most appropriate course of action for the U.S. Supreme Court police officer? Option A. Immediately order the civilian to stop recording, citing the officer's discomfort and the potential for intimidation. Option B. Calmly inform the civilian that they are legally permitted to record police activity in a public space, provided they do not interfere with official duties, and continue with the traffic stop. Option C. Ignore the civilian's recording and proceed with the traffic stop without acknowledging their presence, even if the situation feels tense. Option D. Approach the civilian and demand they hand over the recording device, stating it is interfering with the officer's ability to perform their duties. The correct answer is B. Calmly inform the civilian that they are legally permitted to record police activity in a public space, provided they do not interfere with official duties, and continue with the traffic stop. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a citizen's right to record law enforcement activity and the officer's duty to maintain order and safety. The officer must balance these competing interests without infringing upon constitutional rights or escalating a potentially volatile situation. The presence of a crowd adds complexity, increasing the risk of misunderstanding, panic, or interference. Careful judgment is required to assess the immediate threat, the nature of the recording, and the potential impact on the ongoing investigation or public safety. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves de-escalating the situation by calmly explaining the legal parameters of recording police activity in a public space. This approach acknowledges the citizen's right to record, while also informing them of any reasonable limitations that might exist, such as not interfering with an active investigation or obstructing an officer's duties. The officer should avoid confrontational language and focus on clear, concise communication. This aligns with the First Amendment protections in the United States, which generally permit individuals to record police officers in public spaces, provided they do not interfere with the officer's duties. Ethical considerations also mandate that officers respect citizens' rights and avoid action that could be perceived as intimidation or suppression of lawful activity. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately demand the citizen cease recording without a clear, articulable reason that demonstrates interference with official duties or a threat to safety. This action could be seen as a violation of the First Amendment and an abuse of authority, potentially leading to civil liability and damage to public trust. It fails to recognize the established legal precedent that allows for recording of police in public. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the citizen's recording and continue with the interaction as if it were not happening, especially if the recording is causing a disturbance or drawing an unwanted crowd. While the right to record exists, officers have a duty to manage their environment and ensure public safety. Ignoring a situation that is escalating or potentially compromising an investigation is a dereliction of duty. A third incorrect approach is to physically intervene and confiscate the recording device without probable cause or a warrant. This is a severe infringement on constitutional rights and would almost certainly result in legal repercussions for the officer and the department. Such an action is only justifiable under very specific circumstances, such as if the device itself is evidence of a crime or is being used to actively endanger others, which is not indicated in this scenario. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a de-escalation and communication-based strategy. This involves assessing the situation for any immediate threats, understanding the legal rights of the individual involved, and communicating clearly and respectfully. If a citizen's actions are genuinely interfering with official duties, the officer should articulate the specific interference and request compliance, rather than issuing arbitrary demands. Documentation of the interaction, including the citizen's actions and the officer's response, is crucial for accountability and potential review. Question 7. Research into the legal standards governing police interactions in the United States. A U.S. Supreme Court police officer observes an individual known to have a prior conviction for drug possession loitering in a high-crime area. The individual is exhibiting no overt signs of current criminal activity, such as furtive movements or attempts to conceal anything. The officer, based on their knowledge of the individual's history, suspects they may be involved in drug dealing. What is the most legally sound course of action for the officer? Option A. Immediately detain the individual for questioning based on the officer's suspicion derived from their past conviction. Option B. Stop the individual and demand to know their purpose for being in the area, stating that their past record makes them a person of interest. Option C. Approach the individual and engage in a consensual conversation, making no attempt to detain them and observe their behavior. Option D. Conduct a pat-down search of the individual for weapons, citing the high-crime area and the officer's suspicion. The correct answer is C. Approach the individual and engage in a consensual conversation, making no attempt to detain them and observe their behavior. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge for law enforcement officers, balancing the need for immediate action with the constitutional rights of individuals. Professional challenge lies in the officer's personal knowledge of potential criminal activity versus the strict legal requirements for probable cause and reasonable suspicion. A U.S. Supreme Court police officer must exercise sound judgment, adhering to the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, as well as established case law interpreting these protections. The correct approach involves the officer acting solely on observable, articulable facts that create reasonable suspicion to justify a brief investigatory stop. This means the officer must be able to articulate specific reasons, based on their observations, that lead them to believe criminal activity is afoot. This aligns with the principles established in Terry v. Ohio, which allows for a brief investigatory stop if an officer has a reasonable suspicion that a person is involved in criminal activity. The officer's personal, uncorroborated belief or hunch, even if based on past experience, is insufficient on its own to justify a stop. An incorrect approach would be to stop the individual based solely on the officer's personal knowledge of the individual's past involvement in drug-related activities, without any current, observable behavior that suggests ongoing criminal conduct. This violates the Fourth Amendment's requirement for reasonable suspicion based on specific and articulable facts. Another incorrect approach would be to detain the individual for an extended period to conduct a more thorough investigation without developing probable cause, as this would exceed the scope of a permissible Terry stop and constitute an unlawful seizure. Finally, approaching the individual and asking questions without any articulable suspicion, while permissible as a consensual encounter, would become an unlawful seizure if the individual did not feel free to leave, especially if the officer's demeanor or the context implied a detention. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes constitutional rights and established legal precedent. This involves a continuous assessment of observable facts against the legal standards for different levels of police intervention. Consensual encounters, investigatory stops, reasonable suspicion, and arrests, probable cause. When in doubt, officers should err on the side of caution and avoid actions that could infringe upon individual liberties without sufficient legal justification. Question 8. Which approach would be most appropriate for a U.S. Supreme Court police officer encountering an individual filming their interaction with a suspect during a lawful arrest in a public area of the Supreme Court grounds, where the filming does not physically impede the officer's actions, but is occurring at close proximity? Option A. Engage the individual in a debate about their right to film, explaining why it is inconvenient and potentially disruptive to the arrest process. Option B. Immediately demand that the individual cease all recording, citing the need for privacy during an official law enforcement operation. Option C. Ignore the individual and their recording device, proceeding with the arrest without acknowledging their presence or activity. Option D. Calmly inform the individual of the general right to record while clearly stating any specific, legally permissible restrictions related to obstruction or safety, and continue with the lawful arrest. Correct answer is D. Calmly inform the individual of the general right to record while clearly stating any specific, legally permissible restrictions related to obstruction or safety, and continue with the lawful arrest. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a citizen's right to record law enforcement activity and the officer's duty to maintain order and ensure safety. The officer must balance these competing interests without infringing upon constitutional rights or compromising the integrity of an investigation. Careful judgment is required to de-escalate the situation and uphold legal standards. The best approach involves calmly informing the individual of the general right to record, while also clearly articulating any specific, legally permissible restrictions based on the immediate circumstances, such as not obstructing the investigation or interfering with officer safety. This approach prioritizes constitutional rights while also asserting necessary operational boundaries. It is correct because it acknowledges the citizen's rights under the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which protects the right to film in public spaces, including interactions with law enforcement, as established in numerous court rulings. Simultaneously, it establishes clear, lawful limitations on the recording activity if it directly impedes the officer's duties or poses a safety risk, aligning with established legal precedents that allow for reasonable restrictions on such recordings. An incorrect approach would be to immediately demand the individual cease recording without any justification, citing only the officer's personal discomfort or a generalized claim of obstruction. This fails to recognize the citizen's First Amendment rights and could lead to a violation of those rights, potentially resulting in legal action against the officer and the department. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the individual entirely and continue with the interaction, as if the recording were not happening, even if the recording is actively interfering with the officer's ability to conduct their duties or communicate effectively. This demonstrates a lack of situational awareness and an unwillingness to address a potential issue, which could escalate the situation or compromise the investigation. A further incorrect approach would be to engage in an argument with the individual about their right to record, becoming defensive and confrontational. This unprofessional conduct can escalate tensions, undermine public trust, and distract from the officer's primary responsibilities. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with assessing the immediate threat and the nature of the interaction. They should then consider the individual's rights, specifically the First Amendment protections regarding recording in public. If the recording is not causing a direct and demonstrable obstruction or safety hazard, the officer should allow it to continue while maintaining professional conduct. If the recording does create such an impediment, The officer should clearly and calmly articulate the specific, legally permissible restrictions, focusing on the behavior causing the obstruction rather than the act of recording itself. The goal is to resolve the situation with minimal escalation and maximum adherence to legal and ethical standards. Question 9. Benchmark analysis indicates that a U.S. Supreme Court police officer on patrol near the east front entrance observes a nondescript package left unattended near a public walkway. The package is approximately 2 feet by 2 feet, wrapped in plain brown paper, with no visible markings or sender information. There is a moderate amount of foot traffic in the area, and no one appears to be actively watching the package. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the officer to take in accordance with U.S. constitutional law and established law enforcement protocols? Option A. Begin questioning individuals in the vicinity about their knowledge of the package without any specific articulable suspicion linking them to it. Option B. Continue routine patrols and monitor the package from a distance, assuming it is harmless. Option C. Open the package to determine its contents and assess the immediate threat. Option D. Immediately secure the area around the package, establish a perimeter, and contact the appropriate specialized units for assessment and handling. The correct answer is D. Immediately secure the area around the package, establish a perimeter, and contact the appropriate specialized units for assessment and handling. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a U.S. Supreme Court police officer to balance the immediate need to secure a potential threat with the constitutional rights of individuals. The officer must act decisively to protect the court and its occupants, while ensuring that any actions taken are lawful and do not infringe upon Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. The ambiguity of the situation, a suspicious package with no immediate visual confirmation of a device, necessitates a careful, measured response that avoids overreach. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves immediately securing the area around the suspicious package and initiating established protocols for handling potential explosive devices. This includes notifying the appropriate specialized units, e.g., bomb squad, and preventing unauthorized access to the vicinity. This approach is correct because it prioritizes the safety of the public and court personnel by creating a buffer zone and engaging experts, while simultaneously respecting the rights of individuals by not conducting a search or seizure without probable cause or a warrant, beyond the necessary containment of the immediate area. This aligns with the Fourth Amendment's requirement for reasonableness in law enforcement actions. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately opening the package to inspect its contents. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It constitutes an unlawful search and seizure under the Fourth Amendment, as there is no probable cause to believe a crime has been committed or that the package contains contraband or evidence of a crime. Such an action bypasses established safety protocols and could endanger the officer and others if the package is indeed a dangerous device. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the suspicious package and continue with routine patrols, assuming it is harmless. This is a failure of duty and a dereliction of the officer's responsibility to protect the Supreme Court and its environs. While the Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches, it does not absolve officers of their obligation to investigate credible threats to public safety. This approach could have catastrophic consequences if the package is a genuine threat. A third incorrect approach is to cordon off the area, but then attempt to question individuals in the immediate vicinity about their knowledge of the package, without any reasonable suspicion that they are involved in its placement or have committed a crime. While officers can engage in brief, investigatory detentions, Terry stops, based on reasonable suspicion, a broad questioning of everyone in the vicinity, without specific articulable facts linking them to the package, would likely exceed the scope of permissible investigatory questioning, and could be construed as a de facto seizure without sufficient legal basis. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that begins with threat assessment and immediate safety measures. This involves recognizing potential dangers, prioritizing the containment of the threat, and then engaging specialized resources. Simultaneously, officers must remain acutely aware of constitutional limitations, particularly the Fourth Amendment. The principle of reasonableness guides all actions. If a situation presents a clear and present danger, officers have a duty to act to mitigate that danger, but their actions must be narrowly tailored to address the specific threat and avoid infringing on individual rights without legal justification. When in doubt, consulting with supervisors and following established departmental procedures for handling suspicious items is paramount. Question 10. Benchmark analysis indicates that for the upcoming fiscal quarter, the U.S. Supreme Court Police Department has allocated a total of $75,000 for overtime expenditures. Based on projected operational needs, the overtime hours are estimated as follows. Officer A is expected to work 80 hours, Officer B 75 hours, Officer C 90 hours, and Officer D 85 hours. The standard overtime rate for all officers is $75 per hour. If the department decides to approve all projected overtime, what is the total projected overtime cost for the quarter and would it fall within the allocated budget? Option A. The total projected overtime cost is $25,500, which exceeds the allocated budget. Option B. The total projected overtime cost is $25,500, which falls within the allocated budget. Option C. The total projected overtime cost is $27,000, which exceeds the allocated budget. Option D. The total projected overtime cost is $27,000, which falls within the allocated budget. The correct answer is B. The total projected overtime cost is $25,500, which falls within the allocated budget. Explanation. Benchmark analysis indicates that effective U.S. Supreme Court police officer performance requires a strong understanding of financial principles, particularly as they relate to resource allocation and operational efficiency. This scenario is professionally challenging because it demands precise calculation and adherence to budgetary constraints, directly impacting the ability to maintain security and operational readiness. Miscalculations can lead to understaffing, inadequate equipment, or inefficient use of taxpayer funds, all of which compromise the court's security and public trust. The best approach involves accurately calculating the total overtime costs based on the provided hourly rates and projected hours, then comparing this to the allocated budget. This method ensures that all financial implications are considered before a decision is made. Specifically, calculating the total projected overtime hours by summing the individual officer projections, and then multiplying by the respective overtime rates, and finally summing these individual cost projections to arrive at the total overtime expenditure. This aligns with the principles of fiscal responsibility and prudent management of public resources, which are paramount for law enforcement agencies operating under strict budgetary controls. Adherence to these calculations ensures that any proposed operational adjustments are financially viable and do not exceed allocated funds, thereby preventing potential budget shortfalls and maintaining operational integrity. An incorrect approach would be to simply estimate the overtime cost by taking an average overtime hour per officer and multiplying by a general overtime rate. This fails to account for the specific overtime hours each officer is projected to work, and the potential variations in overtime rates if applicable, leading to an inaccurate financial projection. Such an estimation lacks the precision required for responsible budgeting and could result in significant unforeseen expenses. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize operational needs without a thorough financial assessment, assuming that additional funds can be secured later. This disregards the established budgetary process and the importance of fiscal discipline. It risks creating a deficit and places the department in a precarious financial position, potentially requiring difficult cuts elsewhere or necessitating a formal, and often scrutinized, request for supplementary funding. A further incorrect approach would be to reduce the projected overtime hours across the board without considering the specific operational demands or the impact on officer workload and morale. While cost saving is important, arbitrary reductions can lead to understaffing during critical periods, increasing the risk of security breaches, or compromising the effectiveness of law enforcement operations. This approach prioritizes cost reduction over operational necessity and officer well-being. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making process that begins with a clear understanding of the objective, managing overtime costs within budget. This involves gathering all relevant data, individual officer projected hours, overtime rates, performing precise calculations, and comparing the results against the established budget. If the projected costs exceed the budget, The next step is to explore alternative solutions that balance operational needs with financial realities, such as reallocating existing resources, optimizing shift schedules, or seeking approval for necessary budget adjustments through the proper channels, always with a foundation of accurate financial data. Question 11. Benchmark analysis indicates that a U.S. Supreme Court police officer, while on patrol in Washington, D.C., observes an individual they recognize from previous encounters as having been arrested for drug possession in the past. The officer also notes the individual is exhibiting nervous behavior and is loitering in an area known for drug activity. The officer has no specific current information or evidence suggesting the individual is presently engaged in illegal drug activity or that drugs are located within their nearby parked vehicle. What is the most appropriate course of action for the officer? Option A. Rely on the officer's experience and the known reputation of the area to justify a warrantless search of the vehicle for contraband. Option B. Continue observation and, if specific, articulable facts develop that establish probable cause, seek a warrant to search the vehicle. Option C. Detain the individual for questioning and attempt to obtain consent to search the vehicle, citing the area's reputation for drug activity. Option D. Immediately search the individual and their vehicle based on the officer's suspicion derived from past arrests and observed nervous behavior. The correct answer is B. Continue observation and, if specific, articulable facts develop that establish probable cause, seek a warrant to search the vehicle. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a law enforcement officer's duty to uphold the law and the potential for personal bias or external pressure to influence their actions. The officer must navigate a situation where their personal knowledge of a suspect's past behavior, while potentially relevant to assessing risk, cannot supersede established legal procedures and constitutional protections. The requirement for a warrant based on probable cause, rather than mere suspicion or past associations, is a cornerstone of Fourth Amendment jurisprudence in the United States. This case demands a rigorous application of legal standards and an objective assessment of facts, free from personal conjecture. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves strictly adhering to the established legal framework for searches and seizures. This means that even with a strong suspicion based on prior interactions or intelligence, an officer must obtain a warrant based on probable cause before conducting a search of a private residence. Probable cause requires specific, articulable facts that would lead a reasonable person to believe that evidence of a crime will be found in the place to be searched. The officer's knowledge of the suspect's prior involvement in drug-related activities, while noted, does not, in itself, constitute probable cause to believe that drugs are currently present in the residence. The correct approach prioritizes constitutional rights and established legal procedures, ensuring that any intrusion into a citizen's privacy is justified by sufficient evidence and judicial oversight. This aligns with the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, and the requirement for warrants to be supported by probable cause. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with the search based on the officer's personal belief that the suspect is likely to be involved in criminal activity due to past associations. This approach violates the Fourth Amendment by substituting suspicion and past behavior for the constitutionally mandated probable cause. It bypasses the judicial review process, which is designed to prevent arbitrary government intrusion. Another incorrect approach is to rely on a hunch or a generalized suspicion that the suspect might be concealing evidence. This is ethically and legally unsound, as it lacks the specificity and factual basis required for probable cause. Law enforcement actions must be grounded in objective evidence, not subjective feelings or assumptions about an individual's character. A further incorrect approach would be to attempt to coerce consent for the search from the suspect. While consent can be a valid basis for a search, it must be freely and voluntarily given. Any form of coercion or undue pressure to obtain consent renders it invalid and the subsequent search unlawful. This undermines the principle of voluntary cooperation and can lead to the suppression of evidence. Professional reasoning. Professionals in law enforcement must employ a decision-making process that prioritizes constitutional rights and legal mandates. This involves a continuous assessment of facts against established legal standards, such as probable cause and reasonable suspicion. When faced with situations involving potential criminal activity, officers should focus on gathering objective, articulable facts that support a legal justification for their actions. They must be prepared to articulate these facts to a supervisor or a magistrate to obtain necessary warrants or authorization. Furthermore, officers should be aware of their own potential biases and actively work to mitigate their influence on their judgment. When in doubt, seeking guidance from supervisors or legal counsel is a critical step in ensuring lawful and ethical conduct. Question 12. Risk assessment procedures indicate a suspicious, unmarked package has been discovered unattended in a high-traffic area within the U.S. Supreme Court building. A U.S. Supreme Court police officer arrives on the scene. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the officer? Option A. Proceed with normal patrol duties, assuming the package is harmless and not a security concern. Option B. Attempt to move the package to a less conspicuous location to avoid causing alarm among the public. Option C. Secure the immediate area, establish a perimeter, and request specialized units such as K-9 or bomb disposal if the initial assessment suggests a potential threat, while avoiding unnecessary contact with the package or individuals until backup arrives. Option D. Immediately detain all individuals in the vicinity for questioning to ascertain who may have knowledge of the package. The correct answer is C. Secure the immediate area, establish a perimeter, and request specialized units such as K-9 or bomb disposal if the initial assessment suggests a potential threat, while avoiding unnecessary contact with the package or individuals until backup arrives. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a U.S. Supreme Court police officer to balance the immediate need for information gathering during a potential security incident with the constitutional rights of individuals. The officer must act decisively while adhering strictly to established legal protocols and the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. Failure to do so could lead to the suppression of crucial evidence, civil liability, and damage to public trust. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves immediately securing the scene and requesting backup in specialized units, such as K-9 or bomb disposal, if the situation warrants based on initial observations. This approach is correct because it prioritizes officer safety, the safety of the public, and the preservation of potential evidence without infringing upon constitutional rights. It aligns with established U.S. law enforcement protocols that emphasize a systematic and coordinated response to suspicious circumstances, ensuring that all necessary resources are deployed efficiently and that actions taken are legally sound and justifiable under the Fourth Amendment. This allows for a thorough and lawful investigation. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that involves immediately detaining and questioning all individuals present without any specific articulable suspicion of wrongdoing is procedurally flawed. This constitutes an unlawful seizure under the Fourth Amendment, as it lacks the necessary reasonable suspicion to justify such an intrusion on personal liberty. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the suspicious package and proceed with normal duties, assuming it is not a threat. This demonstrates a failure in risk assessment and a dereliction of duty, potentially endangering lives and failing to investigate a credible security threat. It violates the fundamental responsibility of law enforcement to assess and mitigate risks to public safety. Finally, an approach that involves immediately attempting to open or move the suspicious package without specialized training or equipment is highly dangerous and legally problematic. This could lead to accidental detonation, injury, or death to the officer and others, and could also compromise potential forensic evidence. It bypasses established protocols for handling hazardous materials and potential threats. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with immediate situational assessment, prioritizing safety and evidence preservation. This involves recognizing potential threats, securing the area, and then calling for appropriate specialized assistance. All actions must be grounded in probable cause or reasonable suspicion, as required by the Fourth Amendment, ensuring that any detention or search is legally justified. Documentation of all observations and actions is also critical for accountability and legal review. Question 13. Process analysis reveals a U.S. Supreme Court police officer observing an individual loitering near a restricted area within the Supreme Court building. The individual appears nervous and is glancing around frequently. What is the most appropriate risk assessment approach for the officer to take in this situation, adhering to U.S. constitutional principles and law enforcement best practices? Option A. Conduct a risk assessment based on specific, observable behaviors and circumstances that create articulable suspicion of wrongdoing or danger before considering any further action. Option B. Rely solely on a vague tip from a passerby that the individual looks suspicious without any independent observation. Option C. Detain the individual for a search based on the assumption that anyone exhibiting nervousness in a secure location is a potential threat. Option D. Immediately approach the individual and question them based on a general feeling of unease and the fact that they are in a restricted area. The correct answer is A. Conduct a risk assessment based on specific, observable behaviors and circumstances that create articulable suspicion of wrongdoing or danger before considering any further action. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between the need for swift action to prevent potential harm and the constitutional rights of individuals. A U.S. Supreme Court police officer must exercise sound judgment, balancing public safety concerns with the strictures of the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. The officer's actions must be grounded in established legal principles and departmental policy to avoid violating civil liberties and undermining public trust. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough risk assessment that prioritizes gathering objective facts and articulable suspicion before taking any intrusive action. This approach requires the officer to observe specific behaviors or circumstances that would lead a reasonable person to believe that criminal activity is afoot or that a person is in danger. This aligns with the Fourth Amendment's requirement for probable cause or reasonable suspicion for searches and seizures. By focusing on observable facts and avoiding assumptions or generalizations, the officer upholds constitutional protections and departmental standards for lawful intervention. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves acting solely on a vague sense of unease or a generalized suspicion based on the individual's appearance or location. This fails to meet the constitutional standard of articulable suspicion and risks violating the individual's Fourth Amendment rights. Such an approach is arbitrary and can lead to discriminatory profiling, which is ethically unacceptable and contrary to the principles of equal protection under the law. Another incorrect approach is to immediately detain or search the individual without any prior observation or factual basis, simply because they are in a high-security area. This constitutes an unreasonable seizure and search, as it presumes guilt or threat without evidence. It disregards the presumption of innocence and the fundamental right to be free from unwarranted government intrusion. A further incorrect approach is to rely on hearsay or unsubstantiated tips from unreliable sources without independent corroboration. While information from others can be a starting point, it cannot form the sole basis for a stop or search. Without verifying the information through independent observation or investigation, the officer risks acting on false premises, leading to a wrongful detention or search. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should employ a systematic decision-making process that begins with situational awareness and objective observation. They must then evaluate the observed facts against established legal standards, such as those outlined in the Fourth Amendment. This involves asking, do I have specific, articulable facts that lead me to believe a crime has been committed, is being committed, or is about to be committed, or that someone is in imminent danger? If the answer is yes, the officer must then consider the least intrusive means necessary to address the situation. If the answer is no, or if the suspicion is based on generalized assumptions, the officer should not proceed with intrusive actions. Continuous training and adherence to departmental policies are crucial for maintaining this disciplined and legally sound approach. Question 14. Strategic planning requires U.S. Supreme Court police officers to anticipate potential investigative scenarios. In a situation where an officer observes an individual exhibiting furtive movements near a restricted area of the Supreme Court building, and the officer has a reasonable suspicion that the individual may be involved in a security breach, what is the most appropriate initial course of action to gather information while respecting constitutional rights? Option A. Immediately conduct a full search of the individual's person and belongings to ascertain if they are carrying any contraband or evidence related to a security breach. Option B. Detain the individual briefly for questioning based on reasonable suspicion, and if articulable facts suggest the individual is armed and dangerous, conduct a limited pat-down for weapons. Option C. Approach the individual and begin a detailed interrogation about their presence and activities without first establishing reasonable suspicion for a pat-down or informing them of their rights. Option D. Observe the individual from a distance and wait for backup to arrive, even if the individual attempts to leave the area, to avoid any potential confrontation or accusation of unlawful detention. The correct answer is B. Detain the individual briefly for questioning based on reasonable suspicion, and if articulable facts suggest the individual is armed and dangerous, conduct a limited pat-down for weapons. Explanation: the scenario presented is professionally challenging because it requires a U.S. Supreme Court police officer to balance the immediate need for information gathering with the constitutional rights of individuals encountered during an investigation. The officer must act decisively, while adhering strictly to established legal protocols and ethical standards to avoid compromising the integrity of an investigation or violating civil liberties. The potential for misinterpretation of evidence or improper interrogation techniques necessitates a risk-averse approach that prioritizes legal compliance. The best professional practice involves a measured and legally sound approach to information gathering. This entails understanding the scope of permissible actions under the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, and the Fifth Amendment, which guarantees the right against self-incrimination. Specifically, when an officer has reasonable suspicion to detain an individual for investigative purposes, they may conduct a brief pat-down for weapons if they have a reasonable belief that the person is armed and dangerous. Any further questioning must be conducted in a manner that respects the individual's right to remain silent and their right to an attorney, especially if the individual is in custody or their freedom of movement is significantly restricted. This approach minimizes the risk of legal challenges and ensures that any evidence obtained is admissible in court. An approach that involves immediate, intrusive questioning without establishing reasonable suspicion for a pat-down or clearly informing the individual of their rights if they are in custody represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could be construed as an unlawful seizure or an interrogation conducted in violation of Miranda v. Arizona, potentially leading to the suppression of any obtained statements or evidence. Similarly, conducting a full search without probable cause or a warrant, even with the intent to gather information, violates the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches. This demonstrates a disregard for established legal boundaries and could result in severe legal repercussions for the officer and the department. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the legal basis for any proposed action. This involves assessing the level of suspicion, e.g., reasonable suspicion, probable cause, and determining which constitutional rights are implicated. If detention is contemplated, the officer must consider whether it is brief and investigatory or rises to the level of an arrest. If a pat-down is considered, the officer must articulate specific facts supporting a belief that the individual is armed and dangerous. If interrogation is to occur, especially if the individual is in custody, the officer must ensure Miranda warnings are properly administered. This systematic, legally informed process ensures that actions are both effective and lawful, safeguarding both the investigation and individual rights. Question 15. Compliance review shows that a U.S. Supreme Court police officer, while on duty within the District of Columbia, observes a vehicle with a known suspect wanted for a felony in Maryland speeding away from a U.S. Supreme Court building and entering Interstate 395 South, which leads into Maryland. The officer has probable cause to believe the suspect has committed a felony in Maryland. What is the most appropriate course of action for the U.S. Supreme Court police officer? Option A. Attempt to stop the vehicle within the District of Columbia, even if it means pursuing it a short distance into Maryland, to prevent the suspect from escaping. Option B. Continue observing the vehicle from the District of Columbia but take no further action, as the incident occurred outside of the officer's jurisdiction. Option C. Pursue the vehicle into Maryland and initiate a traffic stop to apprehend the suspect, as the officer has probable cause for a felony. Option D. Immediately contact the Maryland State Police to relay the suspect's information, vehicle description, and direction of travel, requesting they intercept the vehicle within their jurisdiction. Correct answer is D. Immediately contact the Maryland State Police to relay the suspect's information, vehicle description, and direction of travel, requesting they intercept the vehicle within their jurisdiction. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge related to the U.S. Supreme Court Police's duty to protect and serve while adhering to strict jurisdictional boundaries and the Fourth Amendment. The officer must balance the immediate need to address a potential crime with the legal limitations of their authority. Misjudging the scope of their jurisdiction or the permissible actions under the Fourth Amendment could lead to serious legal repercussions, civil liability, and undermine public trust. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves recognizing the limitations of one's jurisdiction and initiating the proper interagency communication. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and effective law enforcement collaboration. By immediately contacting the relevant state police agency, the officer ensures that the investigation and any subsequent actions are handled by the authority with proper jurisdiction, thereby upholding constitutional rights and departmental policy. This aligns with the principle of respecting jurisdictional boundaries, a fundamental aspect of law enforcement operations in the United States. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves the officer attempting to make an arrest within the state of Maryland without confirming their authority or coordinating with local law enforcement. This action would likely constitute an unlawful arrest and a violation of jurisdictional laws, potentially leading to the suppression of evidence and civil lawsuits against the officer and the U.S. Supreme Court Police. It disregards the established legal framework governing law enforcement authority across different jurisdictions. Another incorrect approach is for the officer to ignore the situation entirely because it falls outside their immediate jurisdiction. While respecting jurisdictional lines is crucial, law enforcement officers have a general duty to act when witnessing a crime, especially if there is an immediate threat to public safety. This passive approach fails to leverage available resources and could be seen as dereliction of duty, particularly if the crime is serious and immediate intervention could prevent further harm. A third incorrect approach is for the officer to pursue the vehicle into Maryland and attempt a traffic stop without prior coordination or understanding of Maryland's laws regarding out-of-jurisdiction stops. This could lead to a dangerous situation, potential legal challenges regarding the stop's validity, and could be interpreted as exceeding their authority, even if the initial observation occurred within their jurisdiction. Professional reasoning. Law enforcement professionals must operate within a clear understanding of their jurisdictional authority and the constitutional rights of individuals. When faced with a situation that potentially crosses jurisdictional lines, the primary decision-making process should involve 1. Assessing the immediate threat to public safety. 2. Identifying the relevant jurisdiction. 3. Contacting the appropriate law enforcement agency in that jurisdiction. And 4. Providing all necessary information for them to take action. This collaborative approach ensures that legal boundaries are respected, while still facilitating effective law enforcement. Question 16. Compliance review shows a U.S. Supreme Court police officer observes an individual exhibiting nervous behavior and pacing near a sensitive access point within the U.S. Supreme Court building. The officer has no specific information about the individual's intent, but is aware of the building's high security status. Which of the following approaches best balances security needs with constitutional protections? Option A. Observe the individual's behavior and the surrounding environment for objective indicators of a threat before considering further action. Option B. Detain the individual for questioning solely based on their presence in a sensitive area, without any articulable suspicion of wrongdoing. Option C. Immediately initiate a pat-down search of the individual due to their nervous demeanor and location. Option D. Ignore the individual, assuming their presence and nervousness do not constitute a security risk. The correct answer is A. Observe the individual's behavior and the surrounding environment for objective indicators of a threat before considering further action. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between the need for swift action in a potential security threat and the imperative to adhere to established U.S. Supreme Court police procedures and constitutional protections. Misjudging the risk or overstepping authority can lead to serious legal repercussions, erosion of public trust, and compromise of the integrity of the judicial process. The officer must balance immediate perceived danger with the requirement for probable cause and due process. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a measured approach that prioritizes gathering information to establish reasonable suspicion before escalating to a search. This means observing the individual's behavior and the surrounding environment for objective indicators of a threat, such as furtive movements, attempts to conceal contraband, or direct threats. This approach aligns with Fourth Amendment principles, which require a reasonable, articulable suspicion of criminal activity or danger to justify a stop and frisk. The U.S. Supreme Court's own jurisprudence, particularly cases like Terry v. Ohio, guides officers in determining when such intrusive measures are permissible. This method ensures that police actions are based on concrete evidence rather than mere hunches or generalized fear, thereby protecting individual liberties while still allowing for necessary security interventions. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately initiating a pat-down search based solely on the individual's presence in a high-security area and a perceived nervous demeanor. This fails to meet the reasonable suspicion standard required by the Fourth Amendment. Nervousness alone is not sufficient to justify a stop and frisk. It must be coupled with specific, objective facts that suggest the person is engaged in, or about to engage in, criminal activity or poses an immediate threat. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the situation entirely, assuming that the individual poses no threat because they have not overtly acted suspiciously. This fails to acknowledge the proactive security responsibilities of U.S. Supreme Court police officers. While overreach is a risk, complete inaction in the face of potentially concerning behavior in a sensitive location can be a dereliction of duty and could allow a genuine security threat to materialize. A third incorrect approach is to detain the individual for questioning without any articulable suspicion of wrongdoing, solely because they are in a restricted area. While officers can generally approach individuals in public spaces, prolonged detention or questioning without a basis for suspicion can constitute an unlawful seizure under the Fourth Amendment. The interaction must be consensual or supported by reasonable suspicion to escalate beyond a brief, non-coercive inquiry. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a tiered approach to risk assessment. First, observe and assess the environment and the individual's behavior for objective indicators of threat. Second, if reasonable suspicion arises, engage in a brief, non-coercive inquiry to clarify the situation. Third, if reasonable suspicion of criminal activity or immediate danger is established, proceed with a lawful stop and frisk. Throughout this process, officers must continuously evaluate the evolving circumstances and ensure their actions remain within the bounds of constitutional law and departmental policy. Documentation of observations and justifications for action is crucial. Question 17. Governance review demonstrates that a U.S. Supreme Court police officer observes a vehicle parked in a restricted area with its engine running and occupants exhibiting nervous behavior. The officer has a reasonable suspicion that illegal activity may be occurring. What is the most appropriate course of action to balance immediate safety concerns with constitutional protections? Option A. Detain the individuals for an extended period to observe their behavior and gather more information without informing them of the reason for their detention. Option B. Immediately conduct a full search of the vehicle and its occupants to ascertain the nature of any illegal activity. Option C. Depart the scene without intervention, assuming the individuals are not posing an immediate threat. Option D. Secure the immediate area and the individuals. Then contact the appropriate investigative units and supervisors to assess the situation further and determine the next steps for evidence collection and potential detention. Correct answer is D. Secure the immediate area and the individuals. Then contact the appropriate investigative units and supervisors to assess the situation further and determine the next steps for evidence collection and potential detention. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between the need for swift action to prevent potential harm and the imperative to adhere to established legal and procedural safeguards. A U.S. Supreme Court police officer must exercise sound judgment, balancing the immediate perceived threat against the constitutional rights of individuals and the established protocols for evidence collection and preservation. The officer's actions must be justifiable under the Fourth Amendment and relevant federal law enforcement guidelines. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves securing the immediate area and the individuals involved while simultaneously initiating contact with appropriate investigative units and supervisors. This strategy prioritizes officer safety and the preservation of potential evidence without overstepping constitutional boundaries. By securing the scene, the officer prevents further contamination or loss of evidence and ensures that any subsequent search or seizure is conducted by personnel with the proper authority and expertise, adhering to the warrant requirements or established exceptions under U.S. federal law. This aligns with the principles of lawful investigation and due process. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately conducting a thorough search of the vehicle and its occupants based solely on the officer's suspicion of illegal activity without probable cause or a warrant. This violates the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. Another unacceptable approach is to ignore the suspicious activity and leave the scene without taking any action, which could be a dereliction of duty and potentially allow a crime to occur or evidence to be destroyed. Finally, detaining the individuals for an extended period without reasonable suspicion or probable cause, and without informing them of their rights or the reason for the detention, constitutes an unlawful seizure and infringes upon their liberty. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should employ a decision-making framework that begins with immediate threat assessment and officer safety. This is followed by a careful evaluation of the legal standards for search, seizure, and detention under the U.S. Constitution and federal statutes. When in doubt, consulting with supervisors or legal counsel is paramount. The principle of acting within the bounds of the law, even under pressure, is a cornerstone of professional law enforcement. Question 18. Compliance review shows that U.S. Supreme Court police officers are tasked with maintaining security and investigating suspicious activities within the court's premises. In a scenario where an individual is observed loitering near a restricted area, exhibiting nervous behavior, and matching a general description of someone who had previously inquired about security protocols, what is the most appropriate risk assessment and response strategy under U.S. federal law? Option A. Immediately detain the individual for a full search based on the vague description and nervous behavior. Option B. Ignore the individual's behavior and presence as it does not meet the threshold for probable cause for arrest. Option C. Conduct a pat-down for weapons without any specific indication that the individual is armed or dangerous, solely due to their presence near a restricted area. Option D. Approach the individual, engage in a brief, non-intrusive conversation to ascertain their purpose, and if articulable facts arise suggesting they are armed and dangerous, conduct a limited pat-down for weapons. The correct answer is D. Approach the individual, engage in a brief, non-intrusive conversation to ascertain their purpose, and if articulable facts arise suggesting they are armed and dangerous, conduct a limited pat-down for weapons. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between the need for thorough investigation and the constitutional rights of individuals. U.S. Supreme Court police officers, like all law enforcement, must navigate the complexities of the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, while fulfilling their duty to maintain security and investigate potential threats. The risk assessment here involves balancing the urgency of a perceived threat against the legal requirements for probable cause and reasonable suspicion, ensuring that actions taken are both effective and lawful. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a measured and legally grounded approach. This means officers must first establish a reasonable suspicion that criminal activity is afoot before initiating a stop. If during a lawful stop, specific and articulable facts arise that lead to a reasonable belief that the individual is armed and dangerous, a pat-down for weapons, a frisk is permissible. This approach prioritizes constitutional rights while allowing for necessary security measures based on objective evidence, aligning with established Fourth Amendment jurisprudence. Incorrect approaches analysis. Initiating a full search based solely on a vague feeling of unease or a general description without specific, articulable facts would be a regulatory failure. This violates the Fourth Amendment's requirement for probable cause for a full search and exceeds the scope of reasonable suspicion needed for a stop. Conducting a pat-down for weapons without any articulable suspicion that the individual is armed and dangerous is also a regulatory failure. The frisk is a limited search for weapons and requires a specific justification related to officer safety, not mere suspicion of any wrongdoing. Ignoring the situation and failing to investigate a potentially suspicious individual, even without immediate probable cause for arrest, could be an ethical failure if it compromises the security of the Supreme Court or its occupants. However, acting without the requisite legal justification for a stop or search is a more direct and severe regulatory violation. Professional reasoning. Law enforcement professionals must employ a tiered approach to assessing risk and taking action. This begins with observing the environment and identifying any behavior that deviates from the norm and is indicative of potential criminal activity, reasonable suspicion. If reasonable suspicion is established, a brief investigatory stop is permissible. During this stop, if further observations or information create a reasonable belief that the individual poses a danger, a limited pat-down for weapons is justified. Throughout this process, officers must continuously evaluate the evolving circumstances and ensure their actions remain within the bounds of the law and constitutional protections. Question 19. Compliance review shows that a U.S. Supreme Court police officer observes an individual loitering near a restricted access point to the building, exhibiting nervous behavior but not making any overt threatening gestures. What is the most appropriate initial course of action for the officer to take in this situation, adhering to U.S. constitutional standards and departmental guidelines for risk assessment? Option A. Ignore the individual, assuming they are not a threat, and continue with routine patrol duties. Option B. Immediately detain the individual and conduct a pat-down search for weapons based on their presence in a restricted area and nervous demeanor. Option C. Approach the individual, observe their actions, and attempt to verbally engage them to ascertain their purpose and assess the situation before taking further action. Option D. Draw a service weapon and order the individual to the ground, preparing for a potential confrontation. The correct answer is C. Approach the individual, observe their actions, and attempt to verbally engage them to ascertain their purpose and assess the situation before taking further action. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between the need for swift action in a potential security threat and the requirement to adhere to established U.S. Supreme Court police protocols and constitutional protections. Misjudging the risk assessment could lead to either an unnecessary escalation of force, violating an individual's rights, or a failure to adequately respond to a genuine threat, compromising the safety of the court and its personnel. The officer must balance immediate perceived danger with the legal and ethical obligations of their role. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a systematic and documented risk assessment that prioritizes de-escalation and information gathering before resorting to more intrusive measures. This approach involves observing the individual's behavior, assessing their proximity to sensitive areas, and considering any articulable facts that suggest a threat. If the individual's actions are ambiguous or do not immediately present a clear and present danger, the officer should attempt to engage the individual verbally to understand their intentions and assess the situation further. This aligns with the principles of the Fourth Amendment, which requires reasonable suspicion or probable cause for searches and seizures, and emphasizes the use of the least intrusive means necessary to achieve a legitimate law enforcement objective. The U.S. Supreme Court police are bound by these constitutional standards. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately detaining the individual and conducting a pat-down search based solely on their presence in a restricted area without any observed suspicious behavior. This fails to meet the constitutional standard of reasonable suspicion required for a stop and frisk under Terry v. Ohio, which mandates specific, articulable facts indicating criminal activity. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the individual, assuming they pose no threat, despite their presence in a sensitive area and potentially unusual demeanor. This neglects the officer's duty to maintain security and could be a dereliction of their protective responsibilities if the individual does pose a threat. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to immediately escalate to a higher level of force, such as drawing a weapon, without attempting verbal engagement or further observation, as this would be an excessive and unjustified response to an unconfirmed threat. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should employ a tiered approach to threat assessment. First, observe and gather information. Second, If suspicious behavior is noted, attempt verbal engagement to clarify intent. Third, if articulable facts support reasonable suspicion of criminal activity or a security threat, proceed with a lawful stop and frisk. Fourth, if probable cause is established, consider further action. Throughout this process, officers must continuously reassess the situation and use only the level of force or intrusion that is objectively reasonable and necessary. Documentation of the assessment process is crucial for accountability. Question 20. The evaluation methodology shows that for the upcoming U.S. Supreme Court Police Officer Entrance Exam, a risk assessment is being conducted for a high-profile event. Security planners have identified 3 potential risks: a protest disruption with an estimated financial impact of $500,000 and a 30% probability of occurrence; security breach with an estimated financial impact of $200,000 and a 10% probability of occurrence; and a minor infrastructure issue with an estimated financial impact of $100,000 and a 70% probability of occurrence. What is the total expected financial loss across all identified risks that should guide resource allocation? Option A, $2,600,000. Option B, $700,000. Option C, $350,000. Option D, $450,000. The correct answer is D, $450,000. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that assessing risk in law enforcement requires a quantitative approach to resource allocation and threat assessment. This scenario is professionally challenging because it demands a precise calculation of potential financial losses against the probability of their occurrence, directly impacting the allocation of limited security resources for a high-profile event. Miscalculation can lead to either undersourcing, increasing vulnerability, or oversourcing, leading to inefficient use of taxpayer funds. The best approach involves a systematic calculation of expected loss for each identified risk. This is correct because it aligns with the principles of risk management, which dictate that resources should be prioritized based on the potential impact and likelihood of adverse events. Specifically, in the context of U.S. law enforcement and security planning, the expected loss, L, is calculated as the product of the probability of a specific risk occurring, P, and the potential financial impact, I, if that risk materializes. The formula for expected loss is \L equals P times I by calculating the L for each risk. Law enforcement agencies can quantitatively compare different threats and allocate resources to mitigate those with the highest expected financial impact, ensuring a data-driven and defensible decision-making process. This method directly addresses the core of risk assessment by quantifying potential harm. An approach that focuses solely on the highest potential financial impact without considering its probability is professionally unacceptable. This fails to acknowledge that low probability, high-impact events, while severe, may not warrant the same level of immediate resource commitment as moderate probability, moderate impact events that have a higher overall expected loss. It also ignores the fundamental principle of risk assessment, which is to balance likelihood and impact. Another unacceptable approach is to prioritize risks based on anecdotal evidence or the most recent high-profile incident, without performing a quantitative analysis. This is a reactive rather than proactive strategy and can lead to misallocation of resources. Law enforcement decisions must be grounded in objective data and systematic analysis, not emotional responses or isolated events, to ensure fairness and effectiveness. Finally, an approach that averages the probability and impact across all identified risks without weighting them individually is also professionally flawed. This method dilutes the impact of high-risk factors and overemphasizes low-risk factors, leading to a distorted understanding of the overall risk landscape and an inefficient allocation of security measures. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve 1. Identifying all potential risks associated with the event. 2. Estimating the probability of each risk occurring. 3. Quantifying the potential financial impact if each risk occurs. 4. Calculating the expected loss for each risk using the formula \L equals P times I. 5. Ranking risks by their expected loss. 6. Allocating resources to mitigate the highest ranked risks, considering both quantitative analysis and qualitative factors such as public perception and operational feasibility.